when it came time to decide on a meeting for the topic for the annual meeting, the suggestion was made to explore the relationships between our two islands, Chebeague and Long. As you all know, there's a lot of cross-pollination between all of the islands, but particularly Long and Chebeague since we're so close. So I approached Donna Damon, and she was very excited about this. So she's going to do the bulk of the presentation. Once we get started, I'm going to give a little bit about one of the families that has an interesting story. So Donna, you're on.
This is a 1776 map of Casco Bay. It was taken during the Revolution. You can see Portland is red because it's burned. And you can see a couple of yellow dots on a few yellow dots on Chebeague and one on Long. There may be more than that that weren't painted in, but that kind of shows you where our communities were at the time of the Revolution.
I'm going to talk a little bit about Thomas Doughty, and I know that some of you on Chebeague have already heard his story. Thomas Doughty is the first Doughty, at least in Maine. I'm not sure in the whole United States because there are several spellings of, I know it's not the whole United States because there are several spellings of the name. But he was probably about 20 or so. In 1650, he was a member of the Scottish Army, and it fought in the Battle of Dunbar, which involved the Scottish Army and Oliver Cromwell. It was over the secession and the crown. The Scots folks lost and were all marched to Durham Cathedral in England, northern England. From there, an incredible number of them died, but Thomas did not. Those that survived after a number of months were divided into several groups and sent offshore out of England to faraway places to be indentured servants. And so can we have the next slide, please? So Thomas was sent to Boston with 150 Scotch prisoners on the ship, the Unity. There's a little question about whether he was actually on the Unity or a later one because there's no official manifest, but it appears that that's the one he was on. Most of the prisoners went to some mills around Boston, but a number of them were sent to the Durham area, and he was indentured to Mr. Valentine Hill of Oyster Bay, Dover, New Hampshire. Oyster Bay, actually a number of Mainers came from Oyster Bay over the years. He worked in the sawmills that Valentine had, and he became quite proficient at working in the sawmills. He worked out his indenture and he became a resident of Dover in 1658, which would have been right at the end of his indenture. And there are records of him paying taxes until 1665. He married a couple times, had 7 children. Can we have the next slide? He moved to the south, both the south and the north Berwick area. First South Berwick, working on the Great Works sawmill. This is a photograph of that area as it exists today. This is you can't really see it. The line here is actually a dam. And then there were many other kinds of mills. Of course, the sawmill he was on is gone, but there are many other mills that were built at that spot afterwards. He eventually moved to North Berwick, creating what's called Doughty's Falls. And I'm not quite sure where that is in North Berwick. But he ended up last in Saco, where he was quite prominent in town government. He was a treasurer for a while. There are lots of court records of him going into debt, buying people out of debt, coming out of debt, selling land, et cetera, et cetera. So he died down in that area, but his children dispersed. And his son, James, was born in Saco, had lots of children, was a shoemaker, and then he moved to Augusta. And interestingly enough, after the French and Indian Wars, he was given 2 house lots at the corner of Middle and Exchange Streets. Of course, they weren't Middle and Exchange Streets then, or maybe they were called that. I don't know what they were called then, but right in the old port. And we don't know anything more about it than that. I've not been able to find the deeds for it. I don't know if they burned or what, but anyway. And the next slide, please. And then there were three Davids fall in the three generations of Davids that followed. Donald and Sarah Getchell moved to Brunswick. Sarah was from Brunswick. His son David and Patience Weber stayed in Brunswick, but eventually moved down to North Yarmouth and lived at where Desert Road and Hunter Road are in that area. And then his son David married Mary Bennett, and they're the ones, if you're from Chebeague or anyone will recognize the Bennett name, we're from Chebeague. And they moved there around 1800, 1810, somewhere in that vicinity. And from there, the Dowdies spread out all across Chebeague and other Long Island, Bailey Island, other islands. Let's move on to the last slide. Nathaniel Dowdy, we have an old photograph from I think it's 1905 Portland Press Herald, or whatever the Portland Press Herald was at that time, the Portland Sunday Telegram, showing the Dowdy House, which was built by Nathaniel Dowdy, son William. And the house was built on Cliff Island. It was moved to Ministrel Island. Is anyone living on Ministrel Island now? I had to look up where it
There's a
was.
summer house there.
Okay. And then it was moved, I don't know if it was actually moved to Chebeague, but then it ended up on Long Island in the area where the Kimballs now live, is what Meredith said anyway. And then it descended through several generations there and ended up with either his daughter or her granddaughter, his granddaughter. Can we move on to the next slide? Okay, and this is you. So that's just the first Dowdy here on Long Island. And he's recorded in the 1830 census, in the 1820 and 1810 census. He's elsewhere. So we don't know exactly when he came, but between 1820 and 1830 is when it's thought.
We do know that in 1810, he was living on Bangs Island. If you can believe that, those of you who are familiar with Casco Bay, there were 5 families living on Bangses. He was living there as well as his in-laws, the Eatons, which is kind of interesting. So Long Island and Chebeague have a long history of cooperation and exchanges of people and ideas. But I wanted to go back to the beginning because the line between Chebeague and Long Island, now the towns, began in the 1600s when the Massachusetts General Court sent 2 captains to figure out where the boundary line was going to be between what was Maine and Massachusetts. And they found a white rock on what is now the Cumberland-Falmouth line. And they went 8 miles in and then out to sea. And that line was the line between Maine and Massachusetts. And it's the one that goes through Cliff Island and hits a little bit of Hope. And for a while, it was Falmouth and North Yarmouth. Then it became Portland and Cumberland. And now it's the towns of Long Island and Chebeague. But the line hasn't changed in all of those years. So what's my story? I started understanding that there were connections between Chebeague and Long on Memorial Day because our cemetery lot is on the other side of what we call the Long Island section of the Chebeague Island Cemetery. And my father would always hope that when we were up there fixing our lots, that his kinfolk from Long Island would be there, and oftentimes they were. And as we go through this, you'll find out how we were connected to all these people. I heard family stories. my grandfather, when he was young, his older brothers were on a fishing vessel out of Long Island. So the family went over there and lived. And he had a great story about a bunch of the kids got on the Crow Island and the tide came in and they were stuck, and all the fishermen who were in the fish houses over there just laughed at them until the tide went down. So that was a story. And over the years, I have found more and more connections. And in 2011, Philip Conklin from the Island Institute called me up and said, "Would you write an article about how all the Dowdies in Casco Bay are connected?" I said, "Are you crazy? Do you know how much work that would be?" It's not a 6-page article. And he said, "Well, what about the McVeigns?" I said, "That's just as bad." So what I ended up doing was showing a connection between Chebeague and Long Island. And I chose the rich family who came from Long Island to Chebeague, and the Johnson family who came from Chebeague to Long Island. And so that was where my real interest in this topic came. And as while I've been doing this, I've found so many more. It's amazing. If any of you happen to remember, there used to be this guy on television who sold salad masters, and he was a fast talking salesman, and he would crack the pans together and all this. Well, I'm going to have to be the fast talking salesman. And no, and this is a lot to this. Okay, so what kinds of connections? Why would people cross the Deer Point Narrows? They crossed for fishing, they went fishing together, family connections, friends, finance, and fun. So some of the fun was the island dances, ball games, and boat rides. Donnie McVeigh in his book wrote that his first date with Carol was to taking her to Chebeague to a dance. Danny Adam Miller, who lived on Chebeague, switched partners on a blind date and found her husband, who was a summer guy from Long Island. One woman from Long Island told me that her mother caught her going to a dance on Chebeague because she recognized the sand from Bennett's Cove in her shoes. Um, and I know when I was young, it was exciting when the Long Island boys arrived on Chebeague. There were the inter-island ball games, hanging out on the wharf, riding the boat, and being received by a hero. Now, this is my mother's story. She was on the Casco Bay boat the day that they were going to town meeting when the boat got on fire. And Warren Dowdy, who was Chub Dowdy's father, was on the wharf, and he was a teenager, and he threw a rope and caught the boat, and they were able to pull it in and save them. And my mother was, to her, he was always a hero, and she just had a wicked crush on him. She ended up marrying a Warren Dowdy, but it was the Chebeague Warren Dowdy, not the Long Island Warren Dowdy. Oh, and I wanted to go back to those pictures. So this is the Chebeague Island Hall, and before 1926, this is where all the people on Long Island would have been going for dances. It was called the Golden Cross Hall on Chebeague. So this is a note. Chebeague Dowdies in most cases descend from David, while Long Islanders descend from Nathaniel, except when they don't. So that's some of the Chebeague Dowdies. So the challenges of the genealogical work is that people use the same names over and over. As Karen said, those 3 David Dowdies, that was just the beginning of the David Dowdies. They go all over the place. There were numerous Stephen Dowdies, and it goes on and on. So it can be very confusing. And on Chebeague, um, we have the combination. At one point, we had 11 John Hamiltons living on Chebeague and 14 Marys and 10 Janes. So, on these islands, I don't know why people named the kids the same thing over and over, but it makes this kind of work hard. The other challenge is unreliable sources. Reverend Charles Sinnott, who had roots in Harpswell, wrote a book in the late 18, early 1900s about the Dowdies, and he claimed the connection to the Mayflower. And so that's been perpetuated. That is a myth. What Karen told you is the true story of how our Dowdies came. That was a whole different Dowdy. But for generations, people believed that because of his book. Okay, so this is I'm going to show you how I'm connected to Karen Ray. So this is Job Doughty was one of the sons of the David Doughty who landed on Chebeague. And so he had a bunch of children. Two of them, one was my great grandmother, who was Rachel Miller, and the other one of the others was Stephen Waterman Doughty. And so you can see that where I show up and where Karen shows up. So we're third cousins once removed.
Hi, Marilyn.
We'll hear more about Job's descendants later. And this was his original house that he actually built in Coleman's Cove on Chebeague. So the goals of this is to have an understanding that there are many familial connections between Long and Chebeague. So I found this photograph of the Chebeague Island West End School. That's the area near Bennett's Cove and Coleman's Cove where those kids would have gone to school in 1915. If you look at these people, 54% of them had a Long Island connection. 5 married Long Islanders. One was Bernard Doughty, who married Delma Doughty, and that was the Braley connection. Nettie Doughty married Jim Rich. Ray Ricca married Vera Doughty. Lida Ricca married Tom Wood. Henry Dyer married Mabel Morton. So that, when you think about that, 2 of the people in this picture had one sibling who married a Long Islander. 2 had 3 siblings who married them. 3 had 2 siblings who married them. 5 had an uncle who married, and 5 had a parent born on Long Island. 2 had 3 siblings who married, and 1 had a first cousin. So that's quite a connection just in that one picture in 1915. So now we're going to start looking at the individual families. Let's jump in with the Johnsons. Barnwell and Martha Soule Johnson moved to Chebeague in the early 1800s. She was the niece of Deborah Soule Hamilton, who was the matriarch of the Hamilton family on Chebeague. And her Soule family went directly back to the Mayflower with John Alden and Priscilla and George Soule. The Johnsons had settled at Johnson's Cove, which is the Cricks, if you know that Chebeague. It's that big tidal area on the side facing Bangs Island and Sand Island. Now, this is a picture of Barnwell Johnson Jr., who was a brother to James Johnson. We're going to learn more about him. James Johnson was the ancestor of 7 of his children moved to Long Island. He and his brother Barnwell married sisters who were Littlefields. So any Johnsons on Chebeague are related to all the Littlefields and Thompsons and whomever they're related to. So this is Barnwell. This is the closest that I could get to what James Johnson might have looked like. So this would be his brother, Barnwell Johnson, who stayed on Chebeague. And this place where they are now is what is known as Jenks Landing on Chebeague or Sandy Point. These buildings burned in the 1990s. So James and Susan Littlefield Johnson, they lived at the head of the Cricks. He was born in that house, but then his house was up at the head of the Cricks. And they had at least 10 children. One of their older daughters, Huldah, married Charles McVane, who had just come from Prince Edward Island. And they lived on Chebeague for a while before they moved to Long, which was about 1870. Yes, all McVanes are Johnsons. 1880, 7 of the Johnson children lived on Long, which was 15%, if you counted their children, of the whole population on Long Island. And they married into many Long Island families. In 2011, Meredith Sweet and the Long Island Historical Society had a great display, which you may remember, which connected all the different families. I was so impressed with that. But not all the Johnsons stayed. Because here we have Frank Johnson, who was a son of Robert, who was one of the children who moved to Long Island, came back to Chebeague. It happened that in the late 1890s, Reuben Cleese from Chebeague went over to Long Island and started a grocery store While he was there, his daughter Marjorie married Frank Johnson. His son Clinton married Abby Griffin, and then they all moved back to Chebeague. And so if you any of you who are involved in the fire department probably know Doug Ross. He's a direct descendant of Frank Johnson. So you have the Johnsons on Long Island moving back to Chebeague. Here's some of our present day Johnsons, and you'll hear more about some of them later because they connect to other families that we're going to be talking about. This is one of the photographs from my article in 2011 in the Island Journal. And you see the Johnsons are here on Long Island looking at with Bennett's Cove in the background in Chebeague because that's where they came from. So it's like they're crawling up out of the seaweed, you know. I'm just kidding. But okay, so here's the Miller-Calder connection. We're going back to Job Doughty, whose home you saw, and that was the common relative of Karen and me. So here's Rachel Doughty, who married William Miller, and he's got a whole story which I'm not going to go into today. But if anybody ever wants to hear it, I would be happy to share. And for at one, she was a widow, and at one point, when her sons were young teenagers, they went over to Long to live so they could go fishing. She had 5 children, and 3 of them married with Long Island, had their either they or they had their, I'm sorry, their descendants were married into Long Island. And so more on Lewis and Christiana later. But Mary Ann married John Calder from Campobello. She was a sister of Stephen Waterman Doughty, who was Karen's ancestor. She was also a sister to Eliza Gillum, whose grandson Charlie wrote the Casco Bay song. You know, if you know that song, it's a place that I call paradise and it's not too far away. So that was part of the kinfolk from that. Um, so this is my great grandmother, and she kind of looks more like my grandfather than she does a woman, but she's got her hair pulled back. Um, and what I realized as I was doing this, I have more closer relatives on Long Island on my father's side than I do on Chebeague, which is interesting. So here's the Rachel Miller house at Coleman's Cove, and we're going to go into her connections to her children's connections from here. So here's the Calders of Coleman's Cove, Mary Ann and John Calder. Their house is the fourth house from the right, and it was later owned by her daughter who married a Ricker. And the one next to it is the Job Doughty house that you saw the pictures of. The Calders in the 1890s went over and lived on Bates Island, which, if you're familiar with Bates, it's about the furthest out you can go. And some of the younger children were rowed to Chebeague to stay with their grandmother so they could go to school. And she was actually she was the winter caretaker for the orphanage. There was an orphanage on Chebeague, not for Casco Bay Island children, but for Portland orphans, and they came here for the summer. Annie's brother Harry fished with Walter out there, and they rented it from Moses Dyer, who grew up on Long, and more about the Dyers to come. Son Walter Calder lived on Chebeague eventually and was the ancestor of all the recent Calders who live on Chebeague today. Annie came to live with her brother Harry and helped raise my father after his mother died. And so I've heard a lot of these stories from my father because Aunt Annie was quite, she had a lot of information with them. So her oldest daughter, so this was the oldest daughter of the Calders, Annie Mabel Calder, who was Annie Bell, known as Annie Bell, married Will Ricker. She was the oldest child of the Calders. She was born in the Job Doughty house, and she raised her children in her parents' home, which is now the McCullum House on Chebeague at Coleman's Cove. 4 of her children had ties to Long Island, and 3 moved there. Her granddaughter, Doris Wood, still lives on Chebeague. I mean, lives on Long Island. So the Ricker children, so she was a Ricker. So the Rickers have a long connection with Long Island. Ray Ricker on the left married Vera Dowdy and moved over to Long Island and lived there for quite a while. Elliot, you see this picture in the middle is Elliot Ricker, who was known as Pood, and his brother Billy Ricker. They were at Coleman's Cove on sleds. And Elliot married Elizabeth Morton, who and his sister married George Morton. So his brother and sister married brother and sister. And you can hear more about the Mortons. And then Bill Ricker's son Bob married Roberta Gomez of Long Island. So if you know Bob and Roberta and Suzanne, that's where they come from. Um, the
Nanny.
a younger daughter, Nancy Ellen, married uh, Daniel Charles Train. And Charles Train had come from England with his family. They settled on Cliff Island. And then he came over to Chebeague to work. I assume he was with the Stephen Doughty, who, not the Stephen Waterman Doughty, but another Stephen Doughty, who you'll hear more about, um, on a fishing vessel. And we find him living next door to where Nancy Ellen lived in 1910. In 1910, they actually married, and they have many descendants on Long Island. Charles was a star baseball player in Casco Bay, and he was well known as well as a great fisherman. Beatrice Train was the daughter of Charles and Nancy Train, and she married Ernest Haw. She was born on Chebeague, and you see, I apologize for this terrible picture of B and Ernie Haw, but it was the best I had. And you see David and Paula. And then this is a great photo on the right. B was tall, and she's the tallest girl there. And they're all mending nets down on at Coleman's Cove with Hope Island in the background. So her daughter Dawn married George Bud Johnson on Long Island, and they have many descendants on Long, including, as I said, David and Paula, who were in the picture. And more, there's more to come about the Haws and the Doughty connection, because that's another whole story. B's sister Elizabeth and her friend Thelma Ross are also in the picture mending the nets. So now we're at the Mortons. The Mortons of Long Island are connected to several Chebeague families. The Rickers, which I alluded to, Elliot, who is known as Pood, and lived at Long Island, moved to Long Island and lived out his life there, married Elizabeth Morton. And his sister Dorothy married George Morton. His half brother, Almon Hutchinson, married, she was Mabel Morton's son, married Gladys Miller, and there's more to come with that. Mabel Morton married Henry Dyer, and there's more to come with that. And the Dyers and Hutchinsons lived on Chebeague, while the Mortons, while Pood Ricker and Dorothy went to Long Island. So here's the Lewis Miller family. So Lewis Miller was Rachel Miller's son and Mary Ann Calder's brother. He had two daughters, Gladys and Danietta, and Nancy Train and Annabelle Ricker were their first cousins. Danietta met Ben Sawyer, a summer boy from Long, at a dance at the Golden Cross Hall. And Gladys married Almon Hutchinson, who was the Mortons' half-brother. Lewis' second wife was Lillian Johnson, a half-sister to all of the Long Island Johnsons. So the Dyers also lived at Coleman's Cove on Chebeague. But Gus Dyer on the left, his father, Moses, lived on Long Island. You'll find him in the 1860 census with his parents, Lemuel, his father Lemuel and mother Wealthy. And Gus lived there for a while with his grandparents. His sons Joe and Henry both married Long Island girls. And I've already said that Henry married, well, I'm going to go on to Henry, but Joe, his son Joe married Marion Wallace, known as Ducky, and their son Joe Jr., who is pictured here, spent a lot of time growing up on Long Island. Gus's first, Gus first married Rachel Miller's daughter, Christiana, then her niece, uh, Maggie. So here's Henry Dyer, son of Gus, and he's the father. If you know Bob, you ever heard of Bob Dyer, or you've heard of the Dyers on Chebeague. Uh, and Gus's brother John lived on Cliff Island. So if you know the Dyers over there, this is the same. They're all the same connection. And he married Mabel Morton on Long Island, and so they were married on Long Island. And this is a picture of Henry and Mabel on Long Island right after their wedding. So they had Bob Dyer, who was very talented. He worked on Long Island's roads when the town first became a town with Dickie Clark to fix them up. And he married Beverly Calder, who was the daughter of Walter Calder, who was a brother to Annabelle Ricker and Nancy Train. Now, as I said, there's no test at the end of this. Bev was a first cousin to the Rickers and B. Haw. So then we have, does this house look familiar? Just to remind you, that was the Job Doughty house that he built.
Mm-hmm.
It was bought from the family in the 1880s by Stephen and Amelia Doughty. And Stephen was another Chebeague Doughty, not the one that Karen is related to. Two of his children and some of his grandchildren married Long Islanders. And one of the Doughty children, one of his children was born on Long Island. He was over there working on a fishing vessel when one of his children was born. Now we're going to delve into them. So Everett Doughty was one of his sons, and he married Minnie Barker on Long Island. And he moved over to Long Island and ran a store for a long time over on Long Island and moved back here in the 1940s. And so that's a picture when he was young, and then later on, an older picture of he and Minnie. I knew them very, very well, and they were just wonderful people. And their daughter, Madeline, married Alden Brewer and moved over to Chebeague. Their son, Milton, stayed on Long Island and married and was the father of Sharon Marr. And so if you can get this all straight. So his sister, Emma Doughty, daughter of Steve, married Winfield Haw. And Emma was the mother of Ernest Haw, who married B. Train. Her son, Leon, raised his son, Scotty, who's pictured here, on Chebeague. So she had many children, but Ernest stayed on Long Island and Leon moved to Chebeague. And there's a picture here of Scotty's 8th grade class on Chebeague graduating, getting ready for high school. And in the picture are two of his second cousins, Jackie Doughty in the front, Sanford Doughty's daughter, and Billy Riddle, his father's cousin, Priscilla Riddle's son. Gus and Minnie, so Gus is the third child who had a connection to Long Island, the third of Steve Doughty's. And this would be Sanford Doughty's father, for those of you who knew Sanford. He had two children who married Long Islanders. And he was the son of Stephen, brother of Emma, and also the brother of Everett. His son, Eben, married Carolyn Floyd, who was a Chebeague teacher who came from Long Island. She died tragically giving birth to twins. And one died with her, and the other twin, Floyd Doughty, who's pictured here with the football, was raised on Long by his Floyd grandparents. Gus's daughter, Nettie, a daughter of who was married Jim Rich from Long Island. Here's the other side of the article that I wrote. You see the Rich family down on at Bennett's Cove with Long Island in the distance because they've just swum over from Long Island. So here's Nettie and Jim Rich. He came to Chebeague first to work on Gus Dyer's fishing vessel in Coleman's Cove. And then he met Nettie, and he would row over in a dory to court her. Several of their grandchildren live on Chebeague today. Chris Sherman and John Rich, Alex and Stephen Todd, Kathy and Donnie McNeil, Cindy Riddle and Julie Dowdy. Etta had 11 siblings, including Sanford Dowdy. So there's a lot of connections throughout Casco Bay. Now we're into the Cushing family. The Cushing family is one of the oldest on Long Island. Charlie Kuntz, pictured left, his mother was Charlotte Cushing. He moved to Chebeague when he married Evelyn Dowdy, daughter of Ed Dowdy, who was a brother to Everett and Gus Dowdy and Emma Haw. So Evelyn had many cousins on Long and a deep connection before she married Charlie. Charlie's nephew, Jim Kuntz, moved to Chebeague, and later his niece, Pat, married Billy St. Cyr and moved across the Narrows. And there's a picture of Billy and Pat. Pat was the constable on Chebeague, on Long at the time that Billy and Pat got married, and they're still living on Chebeague. Billy's aunt, Connie Stilfen, married Ellery Fowler from Long, who was a Floyd and Cushing descendant. Ellery moved to Chebeague and spent the rest of his life there. The Ross connection. So Fred Ross was the son of Fred and Emily Higgins and grandson of David Hamilton and Rachel Bennett Ross. So that means all the Rosses are Bennetts, Hamiltons, and Higginses. And he married Nellie Johnson of Long Island in 1904 and moved over there. They were the parents of Harlan, Clarence, Harry, George, Marshall. He was the great uncle of Ernie Burgess and Danny Todd. If you've been out fishing around Casco Bay, you know who Ernie Burgess and Danny Todd are. The Long Island Rosses are Bennetts and Hamiltons. So Ernie Burgess, this is a picture of Ernie Burgess, and his great-grandfather, Jim Burgess, lived on Long, and his grandfather, George Burgess, grew up on Long. So there's another connection. And if you look at this picture here, this is Bennett's Cove, this was where the Rosses lived in this area before they came over to Long. So now this is not a happy story. But this is a story that really resonated with me. I heard this story, I swear, every time I would come home in my father's boat from my mother when we get down by Long Island. She had a great uncle, Benjamin Hamilton, who married Mary Haw, who was the daughter of Joseph and Charlotte Haw. They were married in December of 1860. And in January of 1861, they had gone over to Long Island to visit the Haws, and a squall came up, and they were lost. And so here, I'll read you this. The melancholy accident. 3 lives lost. On Friday last, William Hamilton, Benjamin Hamilton, and Mary E. Hamilton of Chebeague Island, having been on a visit to Long Island, started in a boat from the latter place at 1:30 to return home. At 3:30, Mr. Green, who was on the island gunning, discovered the boat capsized. The bodies of William and Mary were found, but that of Benjamin has not been discovered on Saturday. So this was the Hamilton home on Chebeague where Mary Haw had moved. And this is Benjamin's brother, John Ross Hamilton. Again, the closest we can get to a picture of the person. And so these were the grandparents of Ernie and Leon Haw. So it would have been a great aunt of theirs. And I had heard this story. I didn't know when it happened. And I was giving a talk at a convent because I got a letter from this convent on Christmas Eve to give us a talk. about Casco Bay. And I thought, how can you say no to nuns on Christmas Eve?
Mhm.
So I said yes, and I went there. And at the end of it, a woman came up to me and said, saw you were going to speak, and I thought I might be the only chance I would get to hear the other side of my story. And she actually had a date of when this had happened. So then I was able to go to the Portland papers, and they all covered it, and they all had a different version about whose body was found. But I'm not going to go into that. But it was one of those, and I know that on Long Island, they know the same story that Paula and I have talked about it over the years. So, Toll of the Sea, while we're on that, the Lady Woodbury was a boat that was owned by people from Long Island, and it was lost in the 1870s with folks from. This on the web. Oh, oh, just Siri just told me she found this on the web, so I've got to turn her off on my watch. Um, so it with folks from Long and Chebeague. And the story goes that at one point the Lady Woodbury was going down into the into South America. It was carrying freight back and forth. And at one point it was the boat that had gone the furthest up the Amazon River. And I've traced a lot of it, and they were definitely down around there a lot of the time. But anyway, that boat was lost, and that's another whole story. Um, when I was a kid, Roger Rich, who had married Helen Ross, had moved to Chebeague, and they later moved back to Long, and he was lost off Deer Point on his way home after a fishing trip with Cal Dyer from Chebeague. Jeff Doughty moved to Long Island and was lost one night when he went to check on his boat moored off Long. Some of his family still live on Long and Chebeague. More connections. Amy Tierney's Chebeague curate relatives. Mary Weber married Peter Gomez, and most recently, Tom Wood married Vika Johnson and moved to Chebeague. I've saved the biggest surprise for last. You all know Lorinda. Anna Casso was my mother's second cousin. So Lorinda and I are third cousins once removed. And so she has a lot of kin on Chebeague. So in summary, there are lots of connections. And my husband calls it the random relatives, the people that I meet through the historical society who know that they have had roots on Chebeague, or that find me through DNA. And I have so many on Long Island as well as Chebeague, and it goes both ways. When we became a town, Long Islanders had our back. They were there to testify, to show that they did it and we could do it. When Hope Island was proposed as an LNG site, we worked together to defeat it. We depend on each other for help and wisdom in many ways. May those centuries of old connections continue for years to come. And I'd just like to thank this is a picture of me with my parents, who told me all about our many family connections. Thanks to Karen Ray, who had the idea for this program. Thanks to the Chebeague Historical Society for the photos. And thanks to all of you for sticking with this. I hope you learned something. I'm sure we missed many connections. I know we missed many stories. Now it's your turn. We welcome questions, comments, and stories. Thank you.